a quelqu'un qui a dit que je peux pas jouer aux poupées, et après j'ai pleuré.
Welcome to Papatriarchal, the podcast that reflects on parenthood in the 21st century by trying to free it from the patriarchal model. In our episode of the day, we are going to shake up the usual vision of the role of the father with my guest. Jordan Shapiro, PhD, is a globally celebrated American thought leader. He's senior fellow for the Joan Ganz Cooney Center at Sesame Workshop and non-resident fellow in the Center for Universal Education at the Brooklyn Institution. His Forbes column on global education, learning through digital play, kids and culture, was read by over 5 million people around the world. He is an international speaker and consultant whose fresh perspectives combines psychology, philosophy, and economics in unexpected ways. His book, The New Childhood: Raising Kids to Thrive in a Connected World, changed the cultural conversation about parenting and screen time. In his most recent book, Father Figure: How to Be a Feminist Dad, Shapiro's offers a norm-shattering perspective on fatherhood, family, and gender essentialism. This thoughtful exploration of that psychology, presented from an archetypal perspective, challenges our familial assumption about the origins of so-called traditional parenting roles. We ask ourselves how to evolve in fatherhood by questioning important concepts like narcissistic patriarchal authority, trying to understand how all of this is built in the culture in myth or even Star Wars. We ask too if we can protect our children from gender stereotypes and where to start as a father to move forward on this reflection. I leave you right away with my first question and I wish you a good listen. In your book, you develop several notions such as narcissistic patriarchal authority. That's a huge word.
Too many words. It's too many words, too many syllables, but yes.
What can you tell us about this, please?
Yeah, I use the term narcissistic patriarchal authority in the book, and it's really, I think, the most important word there is the authority word. And in the book, what I do is I sort of unpack the word authority to talk about how it comes from author. It comes, same root as autonomy, same root as authentic. All of these go together, and they have to do with a kind of self, right? They all mean some version of self, and so that's a little redundant, I guess. Narcissistic and authority, which are both about this idea that you're the author, and I use it to talk about what I think a lot of our traditional ways, or at least long held ways of thinking about fatherhood have been, which is that father is it's king of the house. I think when I wrote it, I was reflecting about how when I was a child, I always thought of it as my father's house, even though my mother did most of the work around the house. Right? It's my father's house. And so the idea I'm really trying to get at is this idea that so many dads have just been taught that they're supposed to see it as their house and their family is part of their lives, and everything's sort of a legacy of the dad, a lineage of the dad, which makes the dad not realize that there are individuals around them. That everybody sort of becomes a supporting character in dad's myth. And one of the ideas I talk about in the book is this idea of colliding myths, which is an idea I really like, which is that we're all, it comes from archetypal psychology. We're all living inside our own magical myths. And of course, main characters of our myth, but we forget that the other people are also the main characters of their own myth. So even though they might be the troll beneath the footbridge, or the love interest, or the sidekick in our myths, or the villain in our myths, I'm often the villain in my kids' myth. You sort of forget that you could possibly be the bad guy, or because you think you're the center. And we all do that. It's not unique to fathers. It's not unique to men. It's not unique to anyone. We all forget that everybody else is also the hero in their own story. So therefore, we can't possibly be the hero in their story.
What I understand is that maybe it's the sense of the word patriarchal is that our story is most important than the others.
Yes, absolutely. Dad's story becomes the most important story. And I use the word patriarchal very literally, right? It literally means rule by the father, or structure by the father. And so in some ways, it already has the whole idea in it as a word itself, this idea that the whole family would be organized around the dad.
For me, it's like you say in your book, it's like the story is a myth where the hero is the dad. In your book, you also speak about some of the myths. You make the link between Zeus and Darth Vader and the images of the father we have. Well, How do you do this link?
Yeah. I mean, the idea here is that, again, we're dealing with archetypes here, right? And so we often think that the Zeus image, which is this sort of strong, powerful dad that wields lightning bolts and has authority, and and there's lots of great things about Zeus too, right? I don't want to just make it sound like he's the tyrant. I mean, he is a tyrant, but he also is the one that makes things happen. And we often get stuck and think of that as the only part of a fatherhood image. The truth is, this is an image that has very little to do with gender, right? It has nothing to do with whether you're a man, whether you're the dad, whether you're the mom. We all need to be Zeus sometimes, and we need to not be Zeus at other times. And oftentimes we think we're supposed to be Zeus all the time because that's the image of fatherhood that we've given. Of course, Darth Vader is sort of the dark side of the Zeus energy, right? All dark, no positive. I guess positive in the sense, not certainly not positive in the movie, but in the Star Wars series, it is Darth Vader who manages to organize an entire empire. So he's not incompetent. He's not just evil. He has organized the entire galaxy, just often with the wrong intentions.
And what about the thing that Zeus, like Darth Vader, every time the son has to kill his father?
Right. So this is the sort of the traditional hero myth, I guess probably first explicated by Joseph Campbell, which is this idea that the hero is the son, and part of the son's journey is that he has to have a battle with dad, right? The sort of Oedipal, the Freudian Oedipal journey with dad. And this we sort of take for granted, but I'm not completely sure that it's true. I think it may be a kind of a industrial era consumerist concept, right? This idea that we all need to be rebellious. We all need to be eventually rise up and throw our revolution against the powerful ogre king. And I think this is sad. I'm not saying this never happens and isn't absolutely an essential part of the human experience, but the idea that we think that it's always there for everyone at all times is, I think, problematic. I think there's a lot of other choices and a lot of times when that's not a good solution.
Yes, and you say in your book that there are other myths who could inspire us in the link between father and son. What kind of myths you think of?
Even if you look in antiquity, even if you look in the ancient world, even if you look in the Middle Ages, you're going to find a lot of different kinds of stories of fathers and sons, and that we somehow, and I think it's because of Joseph Campbell and those mythologists of the early 20th century that really got stuck on one image and start to see all of that as the only choice, right? Again, nothing wrong with that image. I'm not trying to say we need to throw that image out. I'm just saying we have to realize that it's just one piece of the whole thing.
You talk about another notions that you call locker room gender essentialism.
This is one of my favorite concepts. It's really just dealing with gender essentialism. Gender essentialism is this concept that there's something essential about our genders, right? So men are one way, women are another way, and that those things are sort of are biologically determined in the sense of psychological things, right? Like all men are assertive, all women are nurturing, right? Which are not true. And I added the locker room to this concept, locker room gender essentialism, because I realized that so many of the things that I learned about how women are, right? I learned in the locker room as a 12-year-old boy where the boys would be like, girls all love it when you do this. And they didn't know anything. You think about 12-year-old boys, they know nothing about the world yet, right? But they're already teaching other 12-year-old girls, boys, these ideas that they're going to get stuck in their head about gender for the rest of their lives. And some of them I didn't even question until I started to write this book. And as I was doing it, I went, whoa, I can remember learning this, and I just realized who taught me it. And it was, there's no reason I should have ever thought that person was an authority other than my own insecurity. We're 12-year-old boys, we're going through puberty, we feel insecure, we want to kiss girls, we want to make friends, sometimes we want to kiss boys, we want to do all, we want to do all these things, and we don't know what to do with ourselves. And then somebody comes and says, this is it. And we're afraid to even challenge it in our own heads because we want to fit in. And a lot of ideas get sort of integrated into who we are at these times. It's really problematic. But the important thing that I'm dealing with is, again, this gender essentialism. You hear it all the time, right? Men are better at spatial reasoning. Women are more risk averse, and none of them makes risk. I'll use the risk averse one as a great example. Like, risk aversion is such a weird thing, right? It depends what you're asking the question about. And we sort of learn it culturally. So certainly, I always think it's funny when I read about like studies that say women are more risk averse. I'm like, well, what would happen if you asked the question as you have to make a souffle very quickly right before the boss comes over, right? Who's going to be more likely to take that risk?
Yes. That's so true. For me, the locker room is so a great notion because it deals with the relationship between boys and boys club. In France, you say I don't know how you call that in US, but in France you say boys club. Okay, and it's about I don't know this word in English. I said in French homosociability, the social relationship between men's only men's. And what rules we need to respect to be recognized as a male by the group. And I think the locker room is a perfect example.
It's, and I think any man who's listening to this from anywhere in the world, I think, can relate to this idea that there are certain rules of male. I use the word, I think, male camaraderie in the book, right? This idea, the way that our friend, what you have to do to fit in, which is impossible, right? Because the whole thing is a constant fight to prove that you're the so-called alpha male, right? You're supposed to trying to prove that I said so-called because there's no truth to the alpha male concept. The person who coined the term tried to get his own book unpublished for many, many years, and the publisher said, "No, we're not getting rid of it because it sells too well." You knew it was wrong. But yeah, the point is we're all in this, and of course, the locker room is one of those locations where we teach these very early ideas about what it means to be a man and to be a woman beyond just what we teach each other as 12-year-olds. Sports are often a location where we solidify or cement problematic gender ideas, and that really needs to be unpacked and considered, especially by parents, right? I think a lot of parents forget how many bad ideas and how much struggle, unhappiness, discomfort happens in those locations, even for the ones who succeed, right? I think, a lot of people sort of imagine, oh, it's just the nerds, it's just the losers who have a hard time, but it's not true because there's no staying on top. It's a game where even if you become the most popular, strongest man in the community, everybody else is just trying to knock you down for the rest of your life anyway, and eventually someone wins. So
Yeah, and there's really a lot of pressure on this male, on this alpha male. I discuss often with dads, and I used to be one of the top. But what happened when you're still not on the top? When it's finished? When you're not the alpha male? And that's really a lot of pressure to live with this so hard believing that you have to be always corresponding about these rules, these pictures. That's not possible, even.
yeah, and of course, no, nobody can maintain it, right? And nobody really, maybe there's like two or three people in the entire planet that, maybe Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are actually alpha male, right? Right? Everybody else has to answer to someone, whether it's investors or even if you're running a country, you have to answer to voters. You have to. There's no version of you get to just be Zeus. It doesn't exist. So it becomes a sort of inherently a battle you're just destined to lose.
Another question. It's also a question of inclusivity. First of all, how do you define it? And how can we be inclusive when we haven't had a model or when society is not exemplary of the subject? That's really difficult, I think.
Inclusivity, the concept is just, how do we, so much as you're pointing out of human history has been about excluding, right? You build a small tribe and you decide who's in and who's out, right? Or a country, who counts as a citizen, who doesn't count as a citizen, or a religious group, right? Well, God likes us, God doesn't like them, right? There's always this sort of building of these divisions, and inclusivity asks us to do something, as you're pointing out, very opposite, which is we're going to take we want to hear the voices that are different than us. We do have a model. I think we've been increasingly doing that as humanity for a very, very long time, and we get better and better and better at it because I think we recognize that most of our progress, most of our innovation, most of the amazing things that we've done as a human species, the ability to feed billion, what are we up to now? 8 billion people, to be able to feed almost all of them, right? At this point, right, comes because of listening to new ideas, learning from others, and getting multiple perspectives. But it's an uphill battle, as I think you're pointing out with the question, which is that we sort of have something that keeps telling us exclude, exclude, exclude somewhere, right? Maybe it's just history, maybe it's just bad history, but then we sort of know that inclusion is better for us in all ways. It creates better economies, it creates better education, it creates more happiness, it creates more longevity, right? The more voices and the more diversity of voices, the better.
There's a kind of inclusivity that is not often named. I don't know for US, but in France, it's inclusivity about children. I don't know if you figure it out because we adults, we made the word for adults, and you talk about exclusion, yes, but children are excluded everywhere. I think. How can they learn inclusivity if they are not included? everywhere.
It's a great example because if you just look at the average city, any major city in the world, whether it's Paris, whether it's New York, whether it's, think about the design, it's not really child friendly, right? The people are starting to do a better job of this, right? They're starting to make crosswalks that are more fun, whether they're like hopscotch, they're starting to build more playgrounds, bus stops that have swings, things like that, which are all great things. But what it should make us think about is just the way that even like the design of a city, who's it including and who's it's not. We can say the same thing when it comes to ableism and handicap communities, right? Like every time they walk, they move, walk, roll, how depending on what they do, on what's going. Anytime someone who doesn't look like me walks through a city, there's a lot of things telling them you don't belong. This is not for you. This was not made for you. This is not designed for you. And I think it's great to use children as an example because it makes it so clear that we do it to children, and then you can start to see all the other groups that we do it to as well. And not because people are trying to do that. See, I think it's really important to say, because I think a lot of this conversation we talk about, and a lot of people get defensive and they go, well, I'm not like, of course, we understand that none of us as individuals are really, I still haven't met the people that are trying to be exclusive. But there are the people who don't see the ways in which the everyday, the sort of quotidian things that we experience and that we create already have agendas built into them. And it's why it's so great to talk to you. That's very much French intellectualism, right? That has taught me that. It's reading the great French thinkers that have gotten me to learn that.
If you think this is possible, only if you think this is possible, okay? How can we, parents, protect our children from gender stereotypes?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard. I think what you're getting to right there is just how impossible it is, right? And it is impossible. We can't shield them completely. There are certainly people who try to raise gender non-binary children, or at least from the very youngest age, they go, I'm not going to even mention the gender until they're old enough to decide for themselves. When I first started to read about this, when I would hear about it on the news, when I would think, oh, that's a little crazy. That's extreme. How could you do that? Like, you can't put that on kids. You can't. But as I learned and talked to more people while writing Father Figure, what I learned was that most people were doing it because what they wanted to do was to make sure actually there weren't the negative gender stereotypes that get automatically put on in all the young years. And you see this everywhere, right? I used to walk my kid when he was first born, my oldest son. I would walk him in a stroller. And I could just tell the way that people would interact with him. There were so many things that became obvious, right? Like the way they would go like, oh, he's going to be a strong one, isn't he? Or if you have a daughter, you walk down, they go, oh, she's so beautiful. She's going to be a heartbreaker one day, right? Already like planting all these ideas. And so this is why whenever anyone says things to me like, well, we had twins and they were a boy and a girl and they came out totally different. So I think there is gender essentialism. And I go, yeah, but it is impossible to avoid stereotypes. They're everywhere. You get them when you walk into a bakery. You get them when you're filling your car with petrol. You get them, anywhere you go. They're all over the place. They're almost impossible to avoid. I think as parents, what we have to do is decide to what extreme we want to try to protect, right? One is to go with this sort of gender non-binary identity for young kids. I'm going to guess that's a little extreme for most parents. Still, you can do a lot of just reminding them. I did a lot with my kids of just sort of challenging ideas. Like we would walk into the toy store and I go, but why is there a boy and a girl section? Why would they care? Like they both look fun to me. I don't know why your genitals would control which toys are fun. That doesn't really make much sense. And so I would challenge my kids on this when they were very little. And that was really powerful because it allowed them to see that these things were questionable. And I think that's the more important thing that parents really need to think about is not how do we protect them from the gender stereotypes, but how do we give them permission to challenge the gender stereotypes.
Thank you very much for this answer. That's totally what I think is important. We can't protect them, like you say, but we can give them some ways to deal with them and to challenge, as you say. It's very, very interesting, and that's very difficult. Let's talk again about fathers and dads. How can we detach ourselves from the old patriarchal schema that we know when we were kids and and we grow up?
To some extent, we cannot detach ourselves from it, and that's worth remembering, right? Some of these things are so deeply embedded in our unconscious that what we have to do is figure out how do we reckon with it more than how do we not do it, right? Right? It's sort of like when we've all been through this, like we don't want to grow up to be like our parents, and then we look at ourselves and go, oh my God, I became just like my parent, and you learn eventually that I can't stop being like them. I need to figure out how to deal with the things that I think are problematic, not avoid them. Otherwise, you get more. And so what we really need to do, I think, is to ask these questions about what else we can do. That's why I think your Zeus question was so great. And I talked about that earlier, is that there are certainly old patriarchal ways that have lots of positive things about them and are needed. The problem is when it's the only way, right? There are certainly times when my children are running too fast towards the street. Me being a dictator that screams stop at the top of my lungs is actually a very good thing because it scares the crap out of them and makes them not run into traffic, right? So this works. This is a reasonable time for me to yell and for me to become authoritative and to do all the things that don't fit with an inclusivity model. But and that's the important thing is recognizing when the old patriarchal model is called for and when the old patriarchal model is actually an obstacle to what we want for our children and want for ourselves.
It's the same thing, I think, about the precedent question about gender stereotypes. We have to deal with it. How do we do? And that's very difficult because in France, psychoanalysis is very, very present everywhere. And the media often promote it, even for education for children. The sentence came back every time. The role of the father is to embody the law in the home and to intimidate the child. Okay, so what do you think about this? And what resources are available to bring another vision?
Yeah. Oh, what a great sentence. That's all over France, huh? I find that very funny because this sentence is Jacques Lacan in some ways. And Jacques Lacan's attempt to sort of save Freud from his own misogyny by claiming it's symbolic, but he's just as misogynist in some ways.
Yes.
I love and anyone who's listening, I love Jacques Lacan. I love Freud. I love to teach them both. I've read both of everything that either of them has ever written. Lacan wrote a lot less, and most of his writing's terrible. But but his ideas are brilliant. But it's important, and there's whole parts of this book where I am ripping it apart and showing the way that the Freudian model of psychoanalysis has actually put problematic ideas about fatherhood, about patriarchy, deep into all of our concepts of what counts as normal and healthy. And we were talking about earlier with the sort of hero father battle, right? We think of this as normal, healthy development instead of one kind of normal development that may not always be healthy. This is what's at the core of that. How do we move beyond this idea? There needs to be the job of the parents is absolutely, I don't know about embody the law. That sounds a little harsh for me, but and intimidate the child is a little harsh, but certainly it is the parents' job to demonstrate what the context of the world, how it behaves, like what are the rules. I am often thinking with my own children, actually, I have to be strict right now because there's going to be so much strictness that they experience in response to this in the future. And it's actually way safer for me to be the one that says no than for them to get it from someone else, because I'm going to love them in the morning. I can say you're being stupid. I can say, I don't say it that way, but I can say you're making mistakes. I can say this is not acceptable. I can do those things. And that's good. You need to experience that as kids, because that's what your parents do as a child is you learn how to accept the world. It's sort of like a tiny little incubation chamber, the parent child, where you have you get to practice for the real forces in the world. And I think that part of Freudian psychoanalysis and Lacanian psychoanalysis is really strong. The problem is that there's no reason for it to be gendered. That's irrelevant, right? Like, I'm not against there being a sense of parenting that is strong. I'm not against authority. I'm all for all of those things. My children would probably go, "Wow, you sound way gentler when you're on a podcast than when you're parenting us." I'm sure that's what they would think. But the bottom line is, this has nothing to do with me being the father. This has to do with me being a parent and giving them what they need in the moment. It is also the father's job at times to nurture. And I would argue that for the modern current father, in the 21st century, and thinking about all the questions we're talking about, inclusivity, feminism, gender, it is our job to actually help, especially our young boys, learn how to deal with that locker room nonsense that causes so much discomfort, right? How do we say, yeah, I know what that feels like. I went through that. That stinks. And trust me, this is going to be better on the other side. And I can help give you the tools to deal with this problematic masculinity.
I think it's very important what you just say, especially about the thing that what psychoanalysts say in France. It's not just one way. It's a way, and there are other ways, and it's not specially about gender, and it's not specially also about intimidate children. So maybe this is a way, but there is a lot of different way that are really, really, really more efficient than intimidation. In this way, the child will learn nothing, and it's a deconstruction. I don't know how to say that in English. Disconstruction. You have this word in English?
Deconstruction, is that what you're?
It's in France we say that when we think about how we grow up and all the thing we have to unbuild, maybe.
Oh yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. So you're talking about, we're socialized all of these things that sort of build a giant tower in our minds, and then we have to knock it down, but then we also have to build a new tower that is
Yeah.
different. Yeah, yeah. I think that's true, and I think you made a great point. Like, I was trying to think, can I think of any time where intimidation might be the best solution, and I really can't. Like, at least not. Maybe if I spend hours, I might come up with one. But as you pointed out, it's not that it won't work. It does work sometimes, which is why you'll have people go, "But it worked for me. That's how I was right." But they, a lot of things worked. It also worked to have humans carry giant heavy blocks before we had cranes, right?
Yeah.
But we learn to do things in better ways as we move forward, and in ways that are better for all of us. And I think that's the most important thing. It's one of the things that always shocked me about writing this book and seeing people who are resistant to it, where almost everything that I'm calling for is in the interest of the father, the child, the mother. Like, everybody succeeds, but people are so stuck in, as you said, these old, whether they come from psychoanalysis. I unpack psychoanalysis in the book because I do think, I think we totally, and maybe not in France, in the US, we definitely don't appreciate the degree to which psychoanalysis has shaped the modern self. Even when I teach Freud, there's so many students like, "Oh, I thought that's all debunked," and I'm always like, I mean, yeah, it's all debunked, and yet we all live with it all day, every day, and believe it, including the people who claim to debunk it. So
That's a huge subject. Trying to be a feminist dad with all of these subjects, with all of these important things that we try to work on, is there not a risk to falling into a form of militant perfection and self-loathing in the face of the difficulties that such an evolution represents?
that's a really interesting question. I certainly recognize this is a risk, but I sort of don't know why it would be a bigger risk with feminism than with just anything else, right? So I think even those who are, if you have the old fashioned, I want to be the patriarchal, dominant, intimidating father, aren't you also kind of always going, am I doing the right thing for my kid? Is he learning? Maybe you're not. Maybe you just go blindly and do what happened to you. But that pretty much, no matter what, makes you a bad parent. I sort of think, like, what makes someone a good parent is their ability to ask constant questions about, am I doing this well? Right. That doesn't mean it's nothing to do with whether or not they do. I think I say this in the book. I go to sleep almost every night of my parenting life going, oh crap, I really screwed that up today at dinner. They asked a question and I said the wrong thing. Do I need to apologize for it tomorrow? Can we just move on? I have to ask that every day. That doesn't need to become militant perfectionism. Like, certainly I don't beat myself up for making those mistakes, but I do acknowledge those mistakes and think about how to not make them in the future. It's an important thing. I hope that anyone who reads my book doesn't fall into a militant perfectionism and instead sees it as, hey, these are tools with which I can reflect on my everyday parenting experience and decide whether I want to make changes, transitions, whether I want to do things differently tomorrow than I did today. And I have 2 kids in college, 2 more living at home. I've been through a lot of this and still don't think I haven't figured out. So, anyone who's listening who's afraid of militant perfectionism, I'll just say, you can write 2 books on parenting. You can be recognized as a parenting expert around the globe, and you're still not going to necessarily feel good about how you do it.
We talk about when we see our mistakes, but I think it's a good way to see our success. And to say that, hey, yesterday I did this, that was a mistake, or a week ago, I don't know. But here I didn't replicate it. I went a different way, and that's a really great success. And I feel really good about this. I think that's important too, to see our success.
Absolutely. And of course, that's true in almost everything we do, right? We should be doing that, whether it's work. This is, again, one of the funny things about gender and industrial and post industrial times is like so many of the things that people are against in thinking about more inclusive gender thinking are actually things they do everywhere else with no problem, right? And they're excited about. When I was first promoting the book, I used to make jokes all the time about where there are so many men that aren't assertive enough to accept feminism, right? I wanted to bully them into feminism and be like, "What? You're not strong enough to accept this, to try this, to fight, right? You'll want to fight everything else on the entire planet because you're so strong, but you won't fight gender stereotypes. What? Something's wrong there."
Yeah, that's a really, really, really good answer. Thank you. Okay, finally, if I were a young father who never asked questions about patriarchy and masculinity, what do you think would be the first decisive step in becoming a feminist dad?
First of all, almost every dad, I think, is feminist at this point. They're willing to admit it or not. Like, I don't meet many dads who are like, I don't think daughters should be allowed to do what sons do, right? I don't see a lot of them. I'm sure they exist somewhere in the world. I don't interact with them. I haven't found them. Even the most conservative people that I have talked to in my life would not be like, I don't think my wife and my daughter are people, right? So at some level, they've already made a huge transition out of what the world looked like 100 years ago. And so in that sense, I would say you've already made a lot of those decisions. And what I'm trying to do is to help young fathers ask, what are the other questions I have to ask in order to do parenting in a way that is, one, in alignment with cultural norms, right? This is one of the biggest challenges. Our model for parenting is people who grew up in a previous generation with different norms, okay? And we're often imitating them, even though it doesn't serve us because we live in a different world. So first we have to adjust for our world, but there's nobody teaching us how to do it because the only model we have is from an old world. So that's a hard thing, and I'm trying to help those.
What I understand is the first step is already done.
Yeah, the first step is done.
Your books will give other questions and other tools to continue on this way.
Yeah, exactly. The first side I was sort of saying we have to have in alignment with what's the context around us, but also what's best for our kids and what's best for, our kids are growing up in a world that involves very different ways of being, very different ways of thinking. Whether you like it or not, this is sort of the thing I want to say all the time to everyone. Whether you like it or not, gender is being renegotiated by humanity, and like it's gonna look different. You can't just say I want it to look the old way. Like,
Yes.
You can, but you're gonna lose. Like, it's pretty obvious. Just look around. Right? We wouldn't be screaming about all these things. There wouldn't be international news about this. It wouldn't exist if we weren't going to move in a different direction. So part of this is preparing your kids to be able to deal with that world. And again, another one of these challenges to the so-called alpha men, which is, are you not strong enough to accept the new world? Are you not strong enough to prepare your children for the new world? Right? Are you too busy screaming about how you're so smart to be able to actually make sure that you're leading people towards a world that is inevitably changing? And I'm not trying to tell you need to be different. I'm not trying to tell you your kids need to be like transgender. I'm not trying to say all I'm trying to say is the world is very different and we need to be inclusive of people. We need to practice that. We need to raise kids and we need to model that behavior in order to raise kids so that they can do it, because you're screwed right now in the world if you're sexist, if you're bigoted, if you're, every company expects you to be able to be inclusive. Every government expects you to be able to be, even the governments that we often think of as being the most restrictive are still more inclusive than they were 15 years ago.
Thank you very much, Jordan, for this discussion.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure, and I'm always happy to do these things because one of the great things about being an author is that you know that your ideas get to all different parts of the world, but you don't often get to talk about those ideas to different parts of the world because of language barriers. The book has been getting a lot of buzz in France. When I first told them they were doing a French translation, people said, "Oh, I don't know if that's going to work. They're very patriarchal in France." They said the same thing about Italy too. And honestly, in some ways, I found the reception in both of those places more open-minded than the reception in the United States.
Yes, because we are not used to read things like this about paternity in France. It's like a refreshing something new that makes us feel really good. Every dad that read your books told me then I feel better.
Oh, makes me so happy to hear.
So thank you so much. I'm very happy to do this episode with you and allow French people to hear your message and there's no injunction. There's nothing such as you must do this in your words, and that's really important. So I say everyone that listen this podcast you can read father's figures, you will feel better after. Okay.
That's good to know. And I love that you said there's nothing sort of directive or prescriptive. Of course, this was one of the hardest things about writing the book. How do you write a book to tell people how to do something while also not being authoritative, which is exactly what you're trying to help them move out of?
That's exactly what I think. That's nonsense. Thank you so much, Jordan Shapiro.
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you for listening. We can find each other on social networks like Instagram, TikTok, or Facebook. See you soon.